Adult School, and we appreciate the faithfulness of you folks who come back semester after semester. We have, as you know, a wonderful lecture series this term. We have a very exciting one for next term, too, that we'll tell you about a little bit later on in the semester. But tonight, we're going to hear from Professor David Feingold. David Feingold is Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, and he's also my boss. So you can be sure I'm going to say some very nice things about him. Prior to joining Rutgers, David was a professor at the Keck Graduate Institute of Applied Life Sciences in Claremont, California, and also he taught at USC's Marshall School of Business. He's the author of more than 90 journal articles and book chapters, and he's written or edited 6 books, including a book called Corporate Boards, Adding Value at the Top, which I've used actually in teaching my class before I knew he was going to be my boss, so that was a genuine choice. And he also wrote a book called Bioindustry Ethics. In fact, his whole area of expertise really is bioscience and bioethics and the interplay between those two with corporate decision-making and research and development. He created the High Skills Ecosystem Framework for analyzing life science innovation systems, and he's used it to analyze developments in a variety of countries such as Singapore, the UK, the US, Australia, and India. Right here in New Jersey, he's taken the lead in creating Bio1 Wired, a workforce and economic development partnership to try to create a bioscience cluster in central New Jersey. And I can testify that he hit the ground running as soon as he touched his toe down in New Jersey. I don't think he's sat down or slept ever since he got here 2 years ago. So please help me welcome David Feingold.
Well, what Barbara didn't say in her introduction, but which is totally true, is that my ability to hit the ground running and the success we've had at the School of Management and Labor Relations rests in no small part thanks to Barbara, who was my direct predecessor as dean, and Jim Bejan, who played the key role in getting us to be a school at Rutgers and played a really transformative role in its leadership. And so it was the faculty that they both built together that attracted me from California, and that did raise a few eyebrows, not least from my own kids, when we said we were going to move to New Jersey a couple of years ago. But it's been great ever since, and there's no one I would rather come speak to than when Barbara asked me to come, and it's wonderful to see the turnout tonight. So I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a really lively discussion. I understand you've already had a couple of great sessions in this series, and it sounds like you have a wonderful lineup to come, and I'll do my best to actually make it to some of those if I can. So what I wanted to talk with you tonight about was the results of this research we've been doing on ethics in the bioscience revolution. When I say the biosciences, what I mean is really a core enabling technology for the 21st century in which we're living. I would use the analogy to think about the role that the computer chips played in all of our lives over the latter part of the 20th century, going from something we thought of as being in computers to something that are embedded in virtually everything we do. Well, the biosciences is much broader than just drugs, where we would think of biotech drugs. It's impacting alternative energy, the environment, agriculture. Some estimates suggest that up to 25% of global GDP over this century will be directly impacted by this technological revolution. And so it's something that not just our scientists, not just our biotech companies, but all of us as citizens really need to know more about. Bioindustry ethics, which was the title of our book, is something which is was always fun to talk about because it's almost always in the headlines, for good or bad. You may have seen the very exciting news released this week about this fascinating new clinical trial that's just been done, suggesting that taking statins not only helps those at high risk of heart disease, but may reduce the risk by 50% for those who have a particular overexpression of a protein in their blood. And that's something, that application of personalized medicine is something we'll come back to later in the talk. But a lot of the times when it's on the front page, it's for bad news, bad press. Things like the scandal over Vioxx and the COX-2 inhibitors. Avastin is a fascinating example. That's the star drug of a company developed by Genentech out in the Bay Area, as close as we've come to a miracle cancer drug. But interestingly enough, it's gotten criticized both for overpricing and for underpricing, and different applications there I can come back to if you want to hear more about. And as a result of particularly issues around concerns about drug safety, concerns about pricing, we've seen a remarkable shift in the public's view of the drug industry. And so an industry which, going into the 1980s, was considered one of the most admired in the US, not surprisingly since they're in the business of making medicines that will improve all our lives, is now viewed in public esteem at about the same level as the tobacco and the arms industry. So we now have industries which are trying to prolong and save life viewed at about the same level as those who are proven to kill it. We also have some highly charged political debates. Merck, for instance, one of the premier pharmaceutical companies here in the state of New Jersey, has an HPV vaccine, which has been proven to have a great effect in preventing cervical cancer in young women. But there's been a huge debate in Texas about vaccinating teenage girls and whether this should be done and something that the state should pay for. And then, of course, stem cells have raised very interesting debates both nationally, internationally, and here in New Jersey, where, to the surprise of many, we voted down the funding for it. It may come back up, and I understand Weiss Young, one of our star professors at Rutgers, will be here later in your series to talk about the exciting research that's being done there. Obviously, this may be one of the first areas where we see a change with the new administration. So here's what I'm planning to cover tonight, and looking forward to hopefully lots of questions from all of you. So quickly, starting with the definition of bioindustry ethics, talking about why it is that firms should care about this issue, what are some of the ethical issues that bioscience firms are facing, how are conclusions of our research on the key factors they can use to make ethical decisions, and then coming at the end to some of the key broader societal bioethical issues we face. This is based on the research that went into the book Barbara mentioned, Bioindustry Ethics. That book features 13 really in-depth case studies of different types of bioscience firms. So we look at large pharma like Merck, we look at Monsanto, the leading bioagricultural firm, we look at Affymetrix, which is in the business of making gene chips, where they can take a little bit of your blood, analyze your DNA, come up with genetic profiles. Genzyme, who I'll talk more about a little bit later. And we also did a company survey of a broader sample to try to get a more representative set of industry practices. It was a great research team to work with because I think between us we covered 6 or 7 different disciplines, several countries, a variety of perspectives, a great learning environment. And in addition to the book, we've published some articles in different venues, including Nature Biotechnology. By bioindustry ethics, I mean really the intersection of 3 what have been historically different domains. So there's bioethics, which I would say are things like your first lecture in this series, end-of-life issues, medical ethics types of problems. There's business ethics, and that would be the kinds of stuff that we might teach in a school of management and labor relations or a business school. What kind of practices, if you're doing business in China, do you operate in the same way here if you have different standards there? What's considered appropriate behavior? And then business strategy issues, which are particularly interesting, I think, in this bioscience industry, where you're dealing with huge investments to develop new products. You're dealing with often life or death kinds of situations. And it's the intersection of all of these and how the firms deal with this wide spectrum of issues that interested us most. So why should firms care about bioethics issues? Well, we asked this question, and what was interesting was when you ask it of most startup biotech firms, what they tell you is, we're not worried about it. And these are some of the reasons why they said they aren't interested in it. One of the reasons is money, right? So if you're a startup biotech company, you're trying to keep the lights on, your business is basically, if your CEO is all about raising capital to keep it going, because it's going to take you 10 years or more to get a product out. And so they say, what we care about is doing that. But the counter argument to that is that fundamentally what venture capitalists, what investors, what others are thinking about when they invest in these companies is the management of risk. And so ethics, broadly defined, is another way of thinking about a risk. There's technology risk, there's regulatory risk, but there's ethical risk. And the big example of this would be if you look at what's happened in the bioagricultural field. That's an example where the technology now works very well. We know how to make genetically modified products, and yet there's been almost no new investment, no new startups in this area. Some reasons for that are IP issues and access to some of the proprietary technology. But another is people are not sure if they're going to be able to sell it globally because of some of the ethical issues that have been raised. A second issue that you'll often hear is these companies are often very small, 5, 10, 25 people, and they'll say, we're not going to worry about this yet. It's going to take us a long time to get to market. If we succeed and the failure rate is very high, then we'll worry about ethical issues. But one of the key conclusions from our book, reinforced by lots of other work, is that the culture of an organization, the way they make decisions, gets shaped profoundly very early. And basically the message to these startup firms is if you think you can behave in whatever way you want now, but then when you're out there competing with a Pfizer and a Merck, that you're suddenly going to become ethical, that's going to be much, much more difficult than if you embed it early. A third excuse we heard, and this was often the most common, is we're doing good science. We're out there to help people. We're trying to discover new drugs or new medicines or new kinds of foods. Why should, of course we're ethical. But the problem here, and this is one that we saw particularly from the Monsanto scientists, was they all felt that too, until they started having to hide their badge and not tell people where they worked because they were being vandalized. They were scared. Because the science mindset and that of the consumer is often very different. And so if you're not attuned to and thinking about your stakeholders, you may run into real problems. And then a final reason we heard, a very common one, particularly here in the US, is we already have to answer to an incredibly high standard and bar through the FDA to get drugs approved. They're turning things down at a very high rate. So if we do everything that they tell us to do, then that's a very high standard that most industries don't have to meet. Well, that's true. They do have high hurdles to meet. But part of the problem in an area like this is that technology, the standards are evolving all of the time. And the FDA is often not on the cutting edge of the curve there. And so you're often having to make decisions for which they don't yet have the answers. And so you have to figure out for yourself what is not only the right business decision, but what's the ethical way to proceed. Other reasons to care about ethics? Well, fundamentally, it's what we would tell our kids, right? This is the right thing to do. But there is also good business reasons. You avoid harm and costs of litigation, right? One big misstep can cost you literally billions of dollars, as well as destroying, tarnishing very powerful brands. Particularly, I think, for the current generation, Gen Y, that's coming through, the millennials, going to join a company which isn't just a good job, a secure job, a good paycheck, but one which is going to make a difference, which is going to have a positive impact, is a very, very powerful attraction and retention tool. Enhancing your public profile and your potential investor pool. There's more and more money out there now in socially responsible investment. And work that I've done on corporate boards that others have done suggests that if this is part of a better overall governance perspective for your organization, it's more likely to generate high levels of shareholder value. And ultimately for this sector, as I think they've already found to their cost, if you don't behave ethically, then the government is forced to step in and take action. And so all of the US economy has paid the cost of the Enron, the Tycos with Sarbanes-Oxley, the whole sets of new regulations that have been imposed on boards, accounting, to try to ensure public confidence and transparency. We're still yet to see what's going to happen as a result of this latest financial crisis with new regulations there. But for this industry, if they can't self-regulate their own behavior, either individual firms or collectively as a sector, then the government is going to be forced to step in and take action. So what are some of the issues we mean by bioindustry ethics? Well, one of them is how do we balance the needs of our investors, our owners, to try to maximize their returns, and the wider stakeholders out there, their potential patients, the doctors, the others that they're trying to serve with their products? How do we balance these? And that's a particular issue when you think about things like the biggest killers around the world, what products to develop, right? For the vast part of the last century, the things that are killing the most people, drug companies have invested almost nothing in developing those medicines. Why? Because there wasn't a large market there. Not in terms of people dying, but in terms of who had the money, right? So the major contagious diseases, dengue fever, malaria, others that have been wiping out millions of people each year, those have gotten much smaller investment than things like heart disease, things like cancer, things even like lifestyle drugs that arguably have much smaller health benefits, but which are ones for which there's a large market in the West. Pricing and access issues, right? When you develop these drugs, particularly if they're life-saving, how much do you charge for it? What do you do to provide access to people who can't afford to pay? We'll talk a little bit about Genzyme in a second, which is the most extreme example we found of this. The ownership and protection of genetic information, as we'll come to a little bit later, this is going to be a particular issue for all of us in an age of personalized and genetic-based medicine, and something that we as a country, I think, are really going to struggle with because of the nature of our healthcare system. Research ethics questions. This has gotten a lot of attention recently. The question about for academics, right? We survive on publishing results. Well, if you're an academic in a Princeton or a Rutgers and you come up with a major new breakthrough, right? You can put that right away into Science or Nature, get a publication that could get you tenure, could get you full professor status, but if you publish it first, you can't patent it because then it's out there in the public domain. So which do? Do you file the patent first? Do you keep it proprietary for as long as possible and maximize the chance that whoever's going to commercialize that might have an edge? Or do you get it out there to the whole world as quickly as possible? And both now are highly competitive. And then perhaps the one which all of you see most in your daily life, the appropriate marketing and advertising of drugs. And this is something, when you trace that fall in public confidence in the industry, a lot of it started to happen in '97, which is when the US, through the FDA, said it's okay to do direct-to-consumer advertising of drugs and medical devices. So I just wanted to show you one of my favorite examples. These two appeared side by side in the New York Times, right? So now we've got coupons, and buy one, get one free have made it to drugs and medical devices. But my favorite part of this, and I don't usually use a pointer, but I can't get up there to show you, right, is, let's see, where is it? The purchased and the free scan must be redeemed on the same visit. So I'm thinking, okay, buy one, get one free heart and lung scan. So what does it mean? Does it mean it only works half the time, so you need two of each? Or is it a couples thing, that you guys go together and you each get your full array of body scans? But as you see, the particular irony of this, of course, is it was running side by side with an article saying that the FDA was levying millions of dollars in fines on drug makers for inappropriate marketing practices. And so this is something we're seeing all the time within this sector. Okay, so let me talk to you about what has been my favorite case to teach out of the book, a company called Genzyme, which is based up in Cambridge, Mass., one of the leading centers of biotech in the US. And Genzyme has specialized in what are called ultra-orphan drugs. So the US government passed some legislation which said that drug makers have been ignoring rare diseases, and we want to create incentives for them to focus on that. So we're going to give them essentially a monopoly for 7 years if they get a new drug approved there. And that's for drugs which are actually not all that rare. So this is defined, an orphan drug is defined as having under 200,000 people in the US. Well, Genzyme was developing drugs where the total global patient population was known to be 5,000 to 10,000 people. So really, really small, rare, they're called lysosomal disorders, where you're missing some key enzymes, and so your body doesn't make it, and they found out a way to genetically produce this and replace that. And essentially what that enabled was kids who were essentially sick from birth, spent virtually all of their life in hospital and then died in their teens, to live lives, go to college, get married, live almost completely normal lives. So a real miracle drug, but with the catch that because the patient population is so small and these drugs are expensive to develop, they're charging $200,000 a year for life to take these drugs. Okay? But they have only two price points for the drugs. So it's $200,000 a year or it's free. Okay, so how many here want the $200,000 a year price point? Okay, and that's globally that they're doing it. So most drugs, when they sell around the world, right, they have a US price. You can probably guess where we are on the spectrum, right? And then they have the British National Health Service price, they have the German price, they have the price in developing countries, usually pegged to the standard of living, and also the market power of their buyer. So in the UK, there's only one buyer for all the drugs. They negotiate pretty hard on price, right? Well, Genzyme, when there's only 4 or 5 patients in a country, right, they didn't want to get in the business of doing this, so they said, either you're going to pay full freight, or if people can't do it, because their motto as a company, which was deeply, deeply felt, was putting patients first. So they didn't want to deny anybody treatment who could benefit from it. But it creates an interesting dilemma. So for the first time, they got legislation approved in Korea, in Egypt, in Poland to adopt orphan drugs. And they went in and through a nonprofit, Project Hope, they provided these drugs for free. But then they went to the government with the NGO and they said, now that we're treating your people, are you willing to pay your share? Right? And in most cases, the government eventually did. And part of the argument was, they said, look, you're only going to have 2 or 3 to cover. It's not going to be a huge impact on your bill. But the question is, in a country like Egypt, right, how much would that 400 or 600,000 have saved if used to do things like better sanitation or public health policies, right? So essentially, the model they're using from an ethical perspective looks a little bit like a very different kind of drug industry, right? The person who goes on the playground and says, would you like a sample? Gets people hooked. And then they end up paying for a long period of time. So really interesting challenges in terms of what fundamentally I believe is a really, really ethical company, but a very challenging pricing model. Clinical trials. So when I teach ethics using this, right, one of the things you teach is the underlying ethical frameworks. Utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, versus a rights view or a justice view of ethics, where each person has inalienable rights you can't violate. Well, we found in Genzyme probably the best single illustration in the whole book of the tension between those two views. So with one of their more recent drugs, the FDA said to them, the results from this clinical trial are amazing. We approve the drug. Remember, these are very, very small trials because the patient population is so small. But there's a catch. So we're going to approve this drug, but you have to continue the trial from phase 3 into phase 4, which is post-market. You have to trace the results long term. So Genzyme argued very, very hard against this. They said, look, we will trace all of these patients, we will give you all the data, we'll do whatever, but don't make us continue this trial. And the reason why, as the head physician who was a Harvard doctor explained to us, was you're asking me to do something where if with my Hippocratic oath as a physician, you're asking me to do something different if I'm wearing that hat than I would in this company. Because think about it from the perspective of the people in that trial and their doctors. So in a phase 3 trial, a gold standard trial now, right? Many of the people are being treated, and some are getting a placebo. They're not being treated. That's how you tell if these drugs are having a real effect. Right? Now you're saying to those patients, the drug is now approved. Everybody can get it. Do you want to stay in the trial? Okay. What they were offering them was free drugs for life if they stayed. So that's a lot of savings. Most of your insurance won't cover it after $1 million lifetime cap, right? So do you want these drugs forever? Or do you want to be sure you're being treated? Terrible position to put people in. And that's why they argued strenuously they didn't. But the FDA's argument was, think about the insurance companies. If you don't have good data to show them there's a long-term benefit to these drugs, are they going to reimburse you for $200,000 a year? So the whole patient population for the life of these drugs benefiting if you keep the trial versus the rights of each patient within the trials. Final one from here, personal conflict of interest. A guy named John Crowley, father, businessman, entrepreneur, has 2 kids diagnosed with one of these rare disorders. Drops everything, goes out, finds the best research, starts his own bioscience company to develop a cure for his kids. They get a drug, they get to the stage where they're ready to go into clinical trials. He realizes, I don't know anything about this business. I'm doing this for one reason, to try to help my kids. I'm going to find the best company out there to get this drugs to market most quickly. I'm going to sell them my company. And that's what he did. He sold it to Genzyme. They had been working on the same disease area. They integrate his with their portfolio. They get to the point where in their final phase 3 trials where they're going to be testing this, right? And John, of course, says, are my kids in the trial? And the doctors who they have on their expert panel say no, because they're defining the trial based on what are the best criteria for maximizing the chance that we will prove the effectiveness of this drug, and his kids are now too old for the cutoff for that trial. So what do? This guy has invested years, built the company, sold it to them, all for this thing. How do they handle his own kids? So what ends up happening is John leaves the company. After the point where this trial is going forward, they create a second small trial for older kids where he's no longer an employee with that potential conflict of interest, and they allow his kids and a few others to enroll in that trial. Okay, so here's a different kind of an example, a personal one, a company whose ethics advisory board I've sat on in the past. This is a company that provides something which you will see more and more of as we enter this age of personalized medicine. They provide personalized genetic screening. So you give them a little DNA sample, they will tell you, give you a full genetic profile, but they're not in the drug business. They're not interested in the disease side so much, but rather in providing you with lifestyle and advice on diet, vitamin supplements, and other things which could make a difference in your overall quality of life. But again, sitting on this ethics advisory board, we face some really interesting issues, right? So they're trying to identify which SNPs, which parts of the genome do they want to give you feedback on, because they're not going to give you your whole thing, just the ones where they believe they have actionable information. So they discover a gene which, if you have this particular SNP and you make certain dietary adjustments, you may significantly reduce your risk of heart disease. But there's a catch. If you have that same gene, you're also at significantly higher risk for early onset Alzheimer's. Okay? So if you're signing up for their service, which tells you it's not about drugs, it's not about whether you should take this medicine or not, it's about these other things that you can affect through diet, through exercise, through other things, do you want to know that information or not? What is their responsibility as a firm? Should they test for it at all? If they test for it, can they tell you the heart disease effect but not this? Should they give you the full information? What's their obligation to tell you about new discoveries? So they give you the profile in 2008. New things come out in 2009, 10. They have your DNA. What should happen then? How should this be provided? And how far does the ethic responsibility extend to partner companies? So they're trying to figure out their business model. They can provide you with a very good profile of what you should do, but there's a vitamin company they work with, right? They make very clean, good vitamins, as good as any other on the market. Should they design and take a cut of what that company designs specifically to your profile to give you the one pill you might need, as opposed to you could probably get the same thing for, say, 1/5 of the cost if you went out to Walmart or your generic place and you just bought each of those separately. Right? So it's not that putting them all together in that pill is going to have any medical benefit. Convenience for you, personalized to you, but how are they going to make money? Is that an ethical thing to do? So quick run through what we decided were the 10 steps that these companies could take to build ethical decision-making more effectively into their process, and then I want to talk to you about some of the bigger societal issues. So the first thing we said was the need to focus on the needs of the end user. This was something, as I said, Genzyme had at the heart and center of the decisions they made, put the patient first. Interestingly, that was the same motto that George Merck established for Merck back in the 1940s, right? If you put patients first, then profits will follow. I would argue it was the absence of that that really undermined Merck as they approached the Vioxx issue. Secondly, the need to start early. I've already made this argument. The companies that think they can ignore ethics, not worry about it when they're at 10 or 20, and then suddenly, when they're at 500 and they're competing in a fierce marketplace that they're going to build it in, are in for a rude awakening. The third important lesson was to lead by example. These things are communicated from the top. It sends a very powerful message about whether the CEO really cares about this or not. Is it rewarded? How is it translated in the organization? But it's not enough to believe that you should be ethical. You need to know what to do. This is a specialized area of expertise. You need to figure out how you're going to educate people, not just at the top, not just a specialist, but throughout the organization to behave ethically. And so we've seen things like ethics advisory boards, in-house ethics experts, education and training. One of the fun examples we saw was in Millennium, another firm based up in Cambridge, Mass., where they had a film series. They showed things like Inherit the Wind or Gattaca, bought pizza, and then they just talked about what are the issues that are raised, how would we deal with some of this in our firm. One of the more powerful things we saw was when you integrate ethics and business strategy. So I guess your next speaker, the former president of Princeton, was the chair of the President's Ethics Advisory Council. The only member of the biotech industry that sat on that council was a guy named Steve Holtzman, who was at Millennium Pharmaceuticals. Steve was at Oxford. He was did moral philosophy there. He was the chief ethics officer, but he was also the most successful single business development officer in the history of the biotech industry. Negotiated 5 deals, each over $500 million with large pharma or agriculture firms. And so the fact that the same guy was responsible for ethics and generating most of the money in the company, people listened when he said ethics is important. Likewise, another company based up in Massachusetts that was a rival to the nutrigenomics company I just mentioned, they decided that actually ethics was so key to their business model that they had a board member who was a Harvard MD, who was one of the leading experts on genetics and ethics in the US. They made him CEO, a guy named Phil Riley, because they said, this is so core to our business model, this will really inspire trust, and we all believe that he'll do the right thing. Number 6, communication, right? The need to create an ongoing dialogue both externally with your core stakeholders, as well as internally in all the different parts of the firm. And one of the best examples we found of that was a company called Novo Nordisk over in Denmark, who had invited in all of the folks who were protesting to an open house to see how they treated the animals in the labs, to see how they conducted research, to ask any questions they wanted about the business model, the way they conducted business, as part of their effort to truly measure their organization not just on finance, but on social and environmental performance. Building structural protections for ethical behavior. So one of the things you find that's a danger is if the people who are responsible for regulatory, the people who are responsible for ethics are too closely tied to the bottom line results of a business unit, there's an inherent tension there, right? So you don't want those same things reporting through the same point. You want to have separate independent lines so that ultimately all of those voices can be heard. The real risks, the dangers can be raised within an organization. And you have things like an anonymous helpline or other ways where people who see particular issues can raise them in a safe way. Treating ethics as a process and not a plaque, not something that's just a nice phrase on a mouse pad or a big thing that gathers dust like the ethics guidelines and Enron, but something that's a living process, right? And so one of the fun examples we found there was a company called Pipeline Biotech in Denmark. They are in the animal testing business. All they did was take contract research from other firms and provide the preclinical testing on different forms of animals. And they empowered their technicians who are running these tests to say, if any of them ever get to the point where you feel it's not ethical in the way we're treating the animals, you can stop it. Ideally, you'll check with the vet, but if they're not there, you're empowered to stop it. And that meant some trials for clients lost their data, but they never got any pushback because they were very transparent about what the process was, how they trained them, how they were empowering them to do it. Extending ethics to your partners. So one of the interesting examples there from Millennium was they had partnered with, a notoriously dubious ethical organization, my old alma mater, Harvard, to do some experiments over in China. They were doing testing for genes that were related to obesity. And they wanted to see if they could identify in some remote rural areas of China whether this existed so that they might build that into medicine. What they didn't realize until they got contacted by a Washington Post reporter for a page 1 story was that same doctor was also looking for genes linked to schizophrenia, which was not something that they were at all interested in commercializing, but raised serious ethical issues in a country like China at that time, where if you were diagnosed with it, the way in which you might be treated was not great. Finally, the 10th of our 10-step process was measuring effectiveness. So one of the things we teach at the School of Management and Labor Relations is you manage what you can measure, and you tend to get what you're going to ask people to report on. And so companies like Novo Nordisk that have developed a triple bottom line, a way of assessing their leaders and their business on this wide array of results and holding people accountable, tend to perform in a consistently more ethical way than those who are only focused on the financial and business results. So from that, let me turn to what I hope will engage you into the discussion piece, which will be a quick run through 4 pretty big future ethical challenges. 1, are we ready for the era of personalized medicine that's coming real fast? 2nd, can we afford to succeed in what we're trying to do with improving health and life? 3rd, will genetically modified food suffer the same fate as nuclear power? And finally, just because we can do something, should we do it? Or conversely, if we can do it, can we stop it? So our healthcare system is widely acknowledged to be broken in some serious respects. We now spend almost 1 out of every $5 in our economy on healthcare. That's twice or more what our main competitors spend. And yet, despite that huge spending, still we have over 45 million people with no health insurance coverage, and many more, particularly in these hard economic times, who may lose it over the course of a 3-year period. Healthcare costs have now become the #1 source of bankruptcy in this country, and we have to ask ourselves, can the government afford to keep paying the market price for drugs, since the government, despite the fact that we have many, many payers here, is still by far the largest single payer for healthcare in the US. So this gives you some comparative data on what we're spending. This is a few years old, so at this point we were only spending a little over 15% of our GDP on this, but as you see, dramatically more than all of the other countries. Everyone's growing, but we're growing at from a much higher and at a larger rate. Despite that high spending, the percentage of our citizens who did not get treatment for some serious health problems is significantly higher than other competitor countries. And when you survey people and you ask, fundamentally, does our system need to be rebuilt, you see that about 1/3 of Americans say that they should, which is not surprising when you consider the percent who don't have health care coverage. But all of these issues that are, took a pretty high profile in this election, at least until the economic crisis, I think hide what will be the long-term structural reason why our particular way of covering people in a private employer-based coverage is not going to be sustainable. And that's the dawning of the age of personalized medicine. So with the sequencing of the human genome, things like you saw in this week's New York Times story are becoming more and more possible. Up till recently, we've thought of genetic diseases as those things which are relatively simple to diagnose, where there's a single genetic mutation and it leads to something which is often terribly debilitating, like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell. But most of where the interest is focused now is not on these single ones, which are relatively easy to identify, but rather the complex interaction of multiple things. So what was going on with this Crestor trial was the fact that all of these people who didn't seem to be at high risk for heart disease, which we know has multiple other factors that cause it, had this overexpression of this particular protein. So if we could get that genetic profile and show the link, then we could treat that particular type of disease. And that type of approach has had some really important early successes. One that's well known is a drug called Herceptin for breast cancer, where about 25% of all breast cancer patients are linked to this particular genetic defect. They diagnose it, and they have a drug that works for that particular patient population. But this poses major challenges both for the drug companies and our healthcare system. The drug companies have resisted because it raises a dirty secret that they don't like to talk about so much, which is the fact that a lot of the drugs we take don't work for a significant part of the population who takes them, because they're right now more of a shotgun approach. We're going to try it. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else, instead of testing your genetic profile, seeing if there's a close fit with what's happening. The other thing, as we heard from Jensheim, is the more personalized you get, the smaller you make the markets, the higher the price tag associated potentially with treating those markets. But the really big thing is, think about a profile, think about where we come as a country when everything becomes a prior condition. And we're not talking here about way, way into the future. There's a company out there now called 23andMe, founded by the wife of one of the founders of Google. If you go there for $399, you can have your genetic profile done. Right? That's not your full genetic profile, but even the full genome within about 5 years is going to be possible for under $1,000. So you're going to have every kid leaving a hospital in the US with the potential to hand them their whole genome. And from an insurance perspective, right, they're not interested in certainty. What they're interested in is probability and risk. So what happens when everything becomes a prior condition in terms of your likelihood of getting different diseases? And will that work in our current way of delivering healthcare? The second question I wanted to raise is, can we afford success? So the good news from a public health perspective is, if you look over the last century, we've made tremendous strides in life expectancy, right? We've gone from where the life expectancy was in the high 40s to a point where it's now well over 80. If you make it to 65 and you're healthy, closer to 90. But the bad news is that our whole welfare state, not just here, but throughout the developed world, was designed around a different era. Does anyone know who came up with the age of 65 for design of a welfare state, retirement policy? Absolutely. The first time, this is a Princeton audience, first time anyone I've ever asked, probably given this talk 100 times, has known it. Okay, so for a bonus round, do you know what the average life expectancy in Germany was when he picked 65? It was 49. So you draw the bell curve, right? The Kaiser was a smart guy. That's how he got to be the Kaiser, right? He figured the payout on that wasn't going to be very high, right? Well, we've kept that age roughly now for the over 150 years. And yet, right, life expectancy now means, and this is bad in the US, we talk about the sustainability of Social Security. Imagine it in Japan, where the population is already shrinking, and they have the oldest population in the world. Imagine it in China, where they're the first country that's getting old before they get rich in terms of their curve, right? They have long life expectancy, but with the one-child policy, they have very few young people to pay for that growing population of retirees. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to support the life that's being sustained? What we're seeing is, the other thing is, right, you know, the old model, the things that killed you were bad, like heart disease, cancer, but they killed you relatively quickly. The things that are killing people more and more now, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other chronic diseases, are very expensive to treat over the life of a patient. So what we're seeing is prolonged life, but also prolonging of periods of significant disability, putting major costs on society. Now, there are some potential alternatives. There's a place called the Buck Institute out in California, where I moved from. They're focusing on studying centenarians, right? And what they found is these folks are like what all of us want to go, which is sort of dying at 102 from a bungee jumping accident. They found that the people who make it to 100 or more are not the ones who manage to survive with 2 forms of cancer and heart disease, but they're the ones who in general have lived very, very long, healthy lives, and then at some point, you know, they deteriorate relatively quickly, and they're trying to understand the genetic, the diet, the other underlying preconditions, and to see if they can translate that into potential therapies. And so I think increasingly for governments, particularly those outside the US with nationalized systems, the focus is on medical research and treatment protocols that will prolong the quality of life rather than prolonging all of life. Because one of the things we find in the US is we spend a very, very high percentage of our total health spending on the last month of life, often for people who have very low quality of life during that period. The third question I wanted to raise is, are GM foods going to suffer the same fate as nuclear power? By that, what I mean is the challenge we face is an enormous one, right? Which is, how are we going to feed the world's growing population without destroying the environment? We made huge strides in the 60s and 70s with the Green Revolution, but that had significant offsetting environmental costs in terms of heavy, intensive agriculture, growth of pesticides and herbicides. But now we face a major challenge, right? Even though the rate of global population growth is slowing, we're still looking at 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. And yet we've used up pretty much all of the arable land we've got to grow food. We've invested very heavily in increasing the productivity of that as much as we can with these pesticides and herbicides. And what's left is probably not the land we really want to be using to grow stuff like the Amazon, where they're cutting down trees at a rapid rate, or other rainforests in order to create new farmland or grazing land for cattle. So what do we do to feed everybody? Well, one of the potential solutions is things like drought-tolerant crops, more productive crops that we can make with genetic modification. The problem with that is that the first generation of the crops that we've come up with for these types of things, the prime beneficiaries have not been the general public, right? Maybe or maybe you don't know that most of the cotton you all are wearing is genetically modified. Most of the soybeans you buy in the US or corn are genetically modified. The beneficiaries of that have mostly been corporate farmers who've had to spend less in terms of the cultivation of their field, in terms of pesticide. Where they've met big resistance is not here in the US, where it happened relatively under the radar, but in Europe, in other developing countries, where they've said, we don't want this. We believe in the precautionary principle. We don't feel we need these things. We'd rather have organic. We can afford without. But this has had knock-on effects in other countries to the extent where when we sent tons of corn to Africa to try to help with starvation, they said, send it back. We don't want it, because some of it might be genetically modified, and if we got it and it got into our system, then we wouldn't be able to sell our exports to Europe or other parts of the world. We've seen an explosion internationally in the sales of transgenic crops and the projections for them, but those projections came before some of the moratorium in Europe, and so, for instance, this had a huge impact in the US sales of corn to Europe as they put that ban in the 1990s. More recently, that has been rescinded. There was a WTO ruling, and the European Union said, we will allow genetically modified foods to a limited extent, but there's been relatively little market adoption up till now because the public there is quite strongly against it. So you now have a proven crop that will work, genetically modified wheat that Monsanto invested hundreds of millions in developing, and they've shelved it because not just their customers over in Europe, but US chains have said, we don't want this. The consumers don't want this in their bread. They don't want to have it, and so we're not going to use it. But we're also seeing resistance to things like golden rice, another fascinating case I like to teach, which is the insert of a vitamin into rice, beta-carotene, that has the potential to cure blindness in millions of children around the world, but we have not introduced it commercially because there's resistance to the idea that somehow this is a way for the large agricultural firms to make profit, even though this is being done, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the firms have said, we're not going to be in the business of selling these seeds, but we will be giving it away. The final question I wanted to raise is this one of, should we do all we can do? The picture here is probably the world's most famous sheep dolly, right? The first cloned sheep. And this is when sci-fi, the notion of cloning, started to become a reality. And so we need to think about the implications of going up the mammal food chain to humans and what will happen, when will happen, the idea of human cloning. When you hear about stem cells, it's really the marrying of cloning technology and stem cell technology that offers the ultimate in the form of personalized medicine. This is the idea of taking a particular disease you might have, modifying a stem cell, being able to then reproduce those cells and replace the things that the body is missing so that you might be able to cure Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or other diseases. Substantial technical progress has already been made here. So we have transgenic animals. We have something that's called farming with a pH. By that I mean we now have goats that will produce drugs in their milk. We have pig semen that can be used to harvest biological drugs. And so we've been able to produce a different kind of factory that produced very little in the way of waste. South Korea had a national holiday when one of their professors was able to produce Snuppy. Snuppy is the first proven cloned dog that they developed there at Seoul National University, which is where it became not Snoopy, but Snuppy. And for $50,000, if you want it, then you can have Fluffy, your pet cat, cloned by a company in Texas. Now, that cat may not have the same personality as Fluffy, but she will have, or he will have, the same genetic profile as your existing cat. The global consensus seems to be that therapeutic cloning, the use of this technology to treat these kinds of diseases, would be a good thing, but that human reproductive cloning, the idea that my job might be easier if there were two more of me and we could all work together as a team, that probably is out. Now, the major exception to this over the last 8 years has been the US, where we have said that we have an interesting sort of compromise policy under the Bush administration, which said you can do embryonic stem cell research on existing lines, but you can't do any on new lines. And the fact was all of the existing lines would never have been suitable for doing human treatment because they had all been blended with animals, and we wouldn't have wanted to introduce those into humans. Several states, most notably California, have bucked the national trend and have put significant dollars to supporting that. And of course, the signs are that this will be one of the first changes by executive order that the Obama administration does. But there's really interesting things that have already happened that raise interesting ethical questions about where we draw the line. So the UK has a national ethics advisory panel. They have already heard test cases which said, is it okay for parents using in vitro fertilization to have children where the express purpose of having the child is to be a bone marrow donor for an existing child who has leukemia? And should it be considered ethical for the government to support that child to be born, where essentially you're using a new child as somewhat of a means to an end? Second interesting thing that already happens is the screening of embryos, right? This is done all the time. It's one of the reasons why we have several tens of millions more boys than girls in China and in India. We consider it ethical to do it, right? If you're having a child and you don't want to have a disease like Tay-Sachs or sickle cell, this would be a way to select one of your own embryos that's disease-free. But is it okay for sex? Is it okay for enhanced performance? When we have a full genetic profile, is it okay to do what you see in the film Gattaca, where they take your potential embryos and they screen them and they say, would you like someone who's going to be 6'2"? We know they're more likely to earn more money, be a CEO if they're taller rather than shorter. What are the kinds of things that you want to pick for? Now here's one that to the people who are non-scientists like myself sounds an awful lot like what we think of as cloning, which is transferring the egg nucleus from one cell into a denucleated egg from another cell, then reimplanting that in order to have a child. Now this is done already today for rare mitochondrial diseases. So if you have a disease in something that's surrounding that, you can take it out of one, put it in another, transplant it, and have a child. So very, very close to what we think of as what might happen with cloning. Is it okay to grow replacement organs in the lab? So there's a major new field within biomedical engineering, tissue engineering, right? People trying to build structures so that you might take your own things, clone cells, not to grow whole replacements of you, but just sort of an inventory of those key organs we'd like to have. So you could have a spare heart, a couple of kidneys, a liver, some lungs, right? And what would be the best container to have all of those in? Well, probably something that looks an awful lot like one of us, right? So where do we draw the line there? And then finally, full human cloning, which several groups have already claimed to have done, but no one has provided convincing evidence that it's actually occurred. So can we stop the cloning? It seems to violate several ethical principles that we would have going back to the start of this field, the idea of doing no harm, the respects for the inalienable rights of individuals. There is some precedent right at the start of the biotech revolution for self-regulation of these kinds of things. There was a famous conference out in California at Asilomar when people first figured out how to do genetic engineering. There were all these wild ideas, those B-grade science fiction films. God, something's going to escape from the lab. We're going to kill all of humankind. It turned out actually that it was much easier to regulate and fairly safe, but they tried to come up with rules to regulate it. Well, I think the reality is we're not likely to be able to completely stop cloning. But what we can do is come up with a consensus within society, within the scientific community, that there are certain things we want to do and certain not, and essentially marginalize or outlaw those things that we don't want to see, though it may still happen for those mad scientists or very rich individuals who are determined to have their own body double. So final slide summary. I think the nations that come up with good answers to these big questions are going to have a serious competitive advantage in this 21st century. So providing some form of universal health care so that you don't have this genetic discrimination from birth. Reforming the retirement laws and the welfare state to rethink what we have now in terms of life expectancy. Increasing public education and the level of debate around GM foods and labeling. And then finally coming up with ways to carefully regulate cloning. So thank you very much for your patience, and happy to take any questions. It's a case of particular interest to me because when I first heard about it and they were doing a story on NPR, I realized that the guy who was arguing for the plaintiffs in the case was an old colleague from Oxford, Dave Frederick, who is a guy who I have immense respect for. I think that while I understand the drug company's argument, I think that the prospect of lawsuits offers a significant restraint, which, if removed, could further damage both the industry's reputation and the public perception of it. I think the only way I would side with where they are now was if we had put in place a very, very effective, well-recognized monitoring system for phase 4 trials. And so the problem, for those who aren't familiar with the case, the issue is essentially if the FDA says a drug is safe and effective, should that then remove any liability on the pharmaceutical companies, exempt them from lawsuits at the state level if it then turns out that a drug has serious health consequences? I think the problem we've seen, I know some of the folks who've looked in detail at the data around Vioxx and others, is that the issue about full disclosure of information, what's known, things emerge even with the best faith trials when you have a 10,000 person trial, when you're treating millions. And the question is, if we have a system that fully shares and has all that data and we monitor it and we pull things that are unsafe quickly, then I'm fine with that. But right now, where that's not necessarily happening, you need, I think, strong incentives to encourage people to fully report. And I think that's what the trials do. But I'm not on the courts. Other question? Yes?
What's your feeling about buying organs from people in poor countries who are willing to sell their organs to make money?
It's an interesting ethical question in terms of the freedom of the individuals, what constitutes coercion based on life. Where do you draw the line in terms of, you can live pretty fine without one kidney. We allow people to donate it here. Should someone who could, say, send their kid to college and feed their family for 10 years be allowed to sell a kidney in India to do it? If it really is totally free and open choice, I see the arguments on both sides. I think we'd all rather they not be put in that situation. I think what's really scary is where you see people harvesting things that they can't live without, but they do it because this is, the only way they feel they have to support their wider family. That's something I think no one would condone as ethical. Yes?
If you were going to make recommendations about reshaping the health insurance, moving away from the employer model, what one or two things would you tell a politician were a good idea?
I'd probably tell them that they need to go to people who know much more about what the solutions would be than me. My own feeling is I think we're at a system in the US where it's pretty clear if you wanted to design a system that would have lower overall costs and better health outcomes. For the interest of time, I didn't show some other slides on, that show we're like, 17th to 20th in the world in terms of health outcomes, despite that spending. You would start from a very different place than where we've got to today. The problem, I think, is post-Hillary and the efforts at creating a major single universal health system. It's very difficult now for either party to get to that point. And so what I would like to see us do is build on the things that work best in the U.S. system and see if we can. So we have a very high outcome system in the VA. We have some state experiments that I think suggest there are ways to cover far more people than we do today. And so I think there probably isn't going to be one single, overall. It might be if you had the academics and but I can't see it getting through today. So what I'd like us to do is at least as quickly as we could move to something which will do it. The other thing that's happened, which just needs really strict enforcement, is we have passed a law banning genetic discrimination of the kind I referred to. The trick will be that's very difficult to do in the subtle ways in which this discrimination might occur in an era where all of that information was available. Yeah?
What do you find are the most effective carrots, as in dangling a carrot in front of a horse, to produce acceptable ethical behavior in the drug industry or drug industry?
Um, I think the most effective things are where people really see the benefits to them as an organization from doing it, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it becomes a deeply ingrained way of attracting people. So one of the things that was striking to us at Genzyme was here was a company that was dealing with the rarest diseases in the world, and yet a very high percentage of the people we spoke to there knew somebody or had a relative who had been directly affected by one of these diseases. And if you want to talk about, a powerful attraction and retention policy, right? Those are people who aren't coming because they got $5,000 more in stock options or because they're being paid a few $1,000s more. They're coming because they want to make a fundamental difference. And so I think having it where the leadership show it and where the people really buy in is very, very powerful. It's much harder, I think, to impose from the outside because, when we teach this stuff, the difference is between ethics and compliance, right? So you can say, here are the things, and once it's been legislated, once it's required, right, that's the stick rather than the carrot, then it's not really about it. It's about, are you conforming with the law, and how can we do the things that will cause us the least pain in trying to meet this requirement or not, as opposed to saying, fundamentally, what are the things that we believe that will have the best outcomes for patients? And you notice I said patients rather than customers, because one of the interesting things about our U.S. health system is often the person or the organization paying the bills is not the same as the person being treated. And so Genzyme was very careful, and Merck in its early days was very careful to say it's the interests of the patient that should really drive our decision. Are we doing the thing that's in their best interest? Yeah.
As corollary, where in the educational process, what stage of the educational process do you think introduction of the concept would be most effective?
The best single discussion of this topic I've ever had was in my daughter's 4th grade class. Kids there you just could not imagine the set of questions. And the other, one of the places where we have the most interesting is The Simpsons. They've had all sorts of episodes dealing with different aspects. So this is something actually people get really early. They may have some fairly wacky ideas about it, but I think we should be having those discussions very early on because it's something that everyone's going to be growing up with and dealing with, and we ought to be able to have open discussion and debate at a very early stage and then continue it through the education. Yeah. Yeah.
In schools like Princeton or Rutgers or a lot of other places, there are industries that have been targeting students for egg donation and sperm donation. And sometimes they're paying extraordinary amounts of money to certain individuals, maybe $25,000, I understand, or higher. Do you think there are any ethical issues related to this type of ministry when we talk about the ethics?
I'm not sure I see any with egg or sperm donation, things where there really isn't any health risk to the donor and where there's a demand for in the market for them. I'm not sure I would see that there is any significant, I'm not sure where the harm is, and there is a potential benefit that's happening out there, that there would be a serious ethical issue. I would have, maybe others do. Yeah. We can talk afterward. Unfortunately, there does tend to be some effects over life on this. So the reason they're on the campuses is they like the young folks, and they tend to need the money. Yes.
Can you talk about direct-to-consumer marketing and the changes it's brought and your position on the
Sure. Well, that tends to be one of the more fun debates we have in the class. You can get really good arguments on both sides. There's only 2 countries in the world that allow it right now. There's us, right, and there's a country where they have about 7 times as many sheep as people, New Zealand, right? So we tend to be the major case people look to. I think it has potentially some really good benefits. I think one of the things that it's done, particularly in the internet age, is the notion that the doctor is all-knowing and shouldn't be questioned is now largely out, right? And now some of the downside of that is you're seeing a lot of people asking for things that they may not actually need, but because they've seen the ads. And some of them are very good detectives because you watch these ads, right? Okay, he's throwing it through the hoop, and what's that ad for? It's often very hard to figure out exactly what's being pitched. I think there's actually probably a pretty good case for, there are different categories of ads that are used, and they have different requirements. I think disease-based educational ads, there's a strong argument that that's probably a good thing. So something that says, you know, here's a thing, type 2 diabetes, here's some of the things, if you have this, go see your doctor, there may be some good treatments. As a public awareness thing, I don't see much problem with that, whether the government or the companies are paying. The branded ads, which are often where their main interest is in getting you to buy a fairly expensive prescription-based, when there's a generic available that could do essentially the same thing for a much lower cost, I think those are much more ethically dubious. And unfortunately, it's really slanted the overall spending of the industry on, because the returns to doing those are very, very well documented. It's a science. It can tell you to the 0.1% rounding error, if you invest this and this is what you'll get in sales. In an industry where you can invest $1 billion and then have a drug that the FDA says no to in phase 3 trials, it's easy to see where you put your money to get that return on investment. And that, I think, is happening more in this sector. I think it's been unfortunate. Yeah.
We're talking about establishing certain ethical standards in the industry, and with a lot of the issues as they come up. And it strikes me that it's hard to expect ethical values that go beyond the ethical values of society in general. So if you have your venture capitalists who are investing in these things, requiring certain returns, or the company's public, it's always the next quarter results that drive everything, rather than, you know, creating something enduring. In the academic community, it's often, as you cited earlier, you know, there's no absolute standards that say we must have certain absolutes. Profit be damned, career be damned. How do you reconcile with this? Can you reconcile with this?
Well, I don't think it's easy to do necessarily, but you know, one of the most basic tests we use is, you know, I would call it the grandmother test, or the New York Times test, right? Which is, you know, for a lot of people, forget all the fancy ethical frameworks and whatnot. If you just said, fundamentally, if you take this action and then you phoned your grandma and you had to explain it and tell her about it, would she be okay with it? Or if this were, what you just did was to be written up on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, would that be a story you'd like to see or not? And I think if you apply that standard to most of the things I've talked about, not all, because some are really difficult, you know, 50-50, it's not a real clear right answer, but a lot of them, most of the things that cause trouble in the industry, you could probably deal with. And the question is, you can know that, but still have a way to make a quicker buck. And are you going to do it or not? And I think long term, it's kind of like the mortgages we've been lending out, right? You made a quick buck by making bad mortgages and then securitizing them, selling them on to someone else. At some point, people knew that was going to come unraveled, but I wasn't going to own the mortgage anymore, be okay. And so, you know, I think the market may allow things to occur, but it doesn't make them right. Yeah.
When you talk about the market, you know, the Venn diagram you had up there,
Yep.
you talked about business ethics and business strategy, bioethics, and you talked about the concept of the patients first. But actually, that's where it's a business, so it's the patient we pick first. As you commented earlier, they're not spending money on investigating drugs that might have much greater beneficial impact for society as a whole. And where is there room for that in this discussion? And is there something wrong with a model that depends that much on business? Because it's not just that, they also have no interest in investigating. Businesses don't have an interest in investigating solutions that don't cost money. So if meditation, for example, was the best solution for a problem, they're not going to spend money researching meditation.
Although my wife was just certified as a yoga instructor, so if anyone would, no, you're right. And actually, some innovative new models have evolved for dealing with some of these things. So we're seeing some new public-private partnerships with financing from places like the Gates Foundation, where nonprofits are working with some companies to address diseases and develop models which the traditional for-profits might not have done. The other interesting thing that's happening, right, is you're seeing huge growth. One of the things I've been studying is the huge growth in the bioscience industry in India. A lot of that has been focused on providing services to US firms, but many of the Indian companies are looking at developing therapies for their huge population, their diseases and diseases of the developing world. And if they can pull it off, they may be able to do it at business models that allow them to do it at a much lower unit cost than we've been doing here. So you're right, there are clear tensions, but I think there are also some innovative models that are starting to emerge that may address it, cause real challenges for folks, the firms here in New Jersey, but also some interesting potential upsides. We had a case study of one the company that just won the most rapidly growing biotech company is called PTC Therapeutics, just outside of Rutgers. They have only 200 employees at this stage, but very, very impressive pipeline. And they're managing 30 biologists and chemists in India and China. And one of the things that's enabled them to do is if they had only had the workers here, they said, here's how much we could afford to finance in our portfolio. And so there's these other things with potentially great therapeutic benefits, but we don't have enough capital to invest in them. It costs them about a quarter as much to do it there, so they put in some lower priority stuff there, got some really promising results, brought it back, wrote an NIH grant, and got $13 million so that they now are able to employ more people and take a drug into the clinic that might never have otherwise seen the light of day because of this new model that exists. So it's not a full answer to your question. There's going to be tension, but I think some interesting approaches. Yeah.
In view of the deregulation that's taking place in other sectors, how do you see the FDA plan for relative to other?
Well, interestingly, there seems to be some emerging bipartisan consensus in DC that the FDA is pretty broken right now, and that it needs some fundamental reform. There's an interesting example. So the FDA has this thing called the Critical Path Initiative, which has been designed to essentially take some of this new way of thinking about medicine, the personalized approach, and to come up with a radical new way of thinking about the whole way we test and approve drugs. And I think it has a great deal of potential. It's been developed with some of the leading scientific experts, with the industry involvement, but they're investing less than 1% of their budget in it. So if you think about, for this huge industry as a whole that spends a tremendous amount trying to get things through it, they're investing nothing collectively in trying to reinvent the model. So I think that's fundamentally wrong. So, one one I would advise this administration not to deal with the whole healthcare is, invest in that in the way you would these firms. And there's an interesting thing, not all that many people know about it, but back in the 90s, they passed a piece of legislation, PDUFA, where in order to get drugs out more quickly, the drug companies all chipped in and put in an extra tax to hire more inspectors so the FDA could actually get the approvals, yay or nay, done in a reasonable time. Similar kind of cooperation to say, look, let's see if we can come up with a model that will make everybody better off, I think would be in everyone's interest. Yeah.
Last question.
Yes, please.
For me, one of the most powerful moments in the presidential debate when President-elect Obama affirmed healthcare as a fundamental human right. Shouldn't access to medicine be a fundamental human right? If so, what are the implications of public policy?
Well, I think we could probably all agree that access to generic medicines, to many things that are out there that are inexpensive and that can have huge effects on life should be a fundamental right. Where it gets tricky is if you look at the UK, right, where they have a great healthcare system. It provides universal coverage. My wife is British. We still got house calls when the kids were young. It's amazing what they'll do there. Tremendous investment in preventative care, but they don't cover all of the new cancer drugs that are available here in the US. And part of the reason is they say we can't afford it. Maybe these work, maybe they prolong life by 3 months or more in some cases, but we can't afford to, given our national budget, to prescribe that for everyone. So at some point, there tends to be limits. And the other issue, right, the reason people have fought price controls here in the US is where will the incentive be for the new innovations if we cap the prices such that we could afford to give it to everybody? And so it's that trade-off that I think makes it really challenging. I think everyone would say, those that are cheap and effective, what's happened with AIDS drugs, right? When they were priced very high, we said, we can't afford to treat everyone. And then, India came out and said, we can do this for $300. And now, they're trying to treat, for example, every patient in Botswana, where a third of the population has HIV. They're trying to get universal coverage there. And so I think as you pull the price down, you can afford to do